don't forget to have a look at our exhibitors' stuff and the posters each time you go to a break. They've put a lot of effort into that. But it's my pleasure now to introduce you to the session chair for the next session, Professor Megan Lewis. Thanks, Megan.
I'm Megan Lewis. I'm associated with the University of Adelaide, where I've had a very long background in environmental remote sensing. I'm presently a member of the Scientific Advisory Panel for TERN, and I've also had a long association with TERN in various capacities. So it's an honour to be invited to chair this session, Evidence-Based Environmental Decisions. Using evidence to inform our decisions certainly is something that is very dear to my heart, and in this session we've got some talks that are presenting a very impressive and wide range of sorts of evidence, so I'm looking forward to them. So over to Geoffrey Heard, who's our first speaker. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name's Geoff Heard. I have the privilege of being one of the co-stewards of the Threatened Species Index. Before I get underway today, I'd just like to acknowledge Taylor Lowry, who's my co-author and also co-steward of the Threatened Species Index. Taylor's not here today. She's based in Melbourne, but will be tuning in online. So my task today is to give you a bit of an introduction to the TSX, tell you a little bit about its history, why it's important, why it's a really crucial part of Australia's evidence base in environmental and conservation planning, tell you a little bit about our last release of the index, and then what we're doing to further the index, to progress it going forward. So a brief history of the TSX. As Hugh mentioned this morning, the TSX came out of the Threatened Species Recovery Hub based at UQ here in Brisbane. It was Hugh's baby. Hugh is very much the brainchild of the TSX. And Hugh recognised that while Australia collects huge amounts of monitoring data for threatened species and species in general, there wasn't any central repository for that data, and as such we couldn't produce syntheses of abundance and produce trends of abundance through time. So Hugh pursued this project to get this thing called the Threatened Species Index up and running, and he enlisted the help of 3 postdocs from UQ to build this thing. Firstly, I'd like to recognise Dr. Elisa Bayraktarov, who's here today. Elisa led the charge in creating the TSX and worked tirelessly for years to do so. Elisa was joined by Aisha Tulloch, now with QUT, and later on Misha Jackson. And Hugh tasked Elisa, Aisha and Misha with the task of reaching out to Australia's biodiversity community and seeking all of their data, basically haranguing them, getting their data on the abundance of our threatened species and near threatened species to pull together into this central repository and allow us to build and estimate trends of abundance through time. So it was an extraordinary project under the TSR, and they collated massive amounts of information, as you'll see. There was 3 incarnations. So the TSX started life as the Threatened Bird Index in 2018 in collaboration with BirdLife Australia, who remain a key collaborator. The Threatened Mammal Index came in 2019, so Aisha Tulloch led that, accruing threatened mammal data from across the country. And in 6 months, Misha Jackson produced the Threatened Plant Index, working with botanists and ecologists from right across the country to gather monitoring data for our threatened plants. So an extraordinary effort. When the TSR hub finished up, the TSX migrated to TERN, which is its now home and where I am based. And over the last 18 months or so, with co-funding from DQ, we've been pursuing 3 objectives. So firstly, to grow the data set. So there was an extraordinary data set already compiled for birds, mammals and plants, but we knew there was more out there, and so we've been working to grow that data set. We've been building some additional functionality for the TSX, so for our infrastructure, which I'll show you a little bit later. And we want to add more species groups, of course. So the TSX currently includes mammals, birds and plants, but we want to bring in other groups for which there is also rich data in Australia. So that's the history. 6 years of data collation, those 3 major taxon groups. We're up to almost 20,000 time series now of threatened species and near threatened species abundance from right across the continent, including some of our key offshore territories, Christmas Island, Cocos Keeling Islands, Lord Howe and Norfolk, and over 10,000 monitoring sites. So it's now become what it was hoped it would be, that central repository of threatened species monitoring data for the country. So why is it important to have something like the TSX? So you'll know that every 5 years the Australian government releases the State of the Environment report. Up until the last one, there was no rigorous, objective information on trends of our biodiversity. There was in the last one because of the TSX. So the TSX now is really become one of the key metrics of how our biodiversity is tracking in Australia. And indeed, it really is the only one. As Hugh mentioned this morning, the TSX has now become one of the 50 indicators of Australia's well-being in the Measuring What Matters initiative of the federal government. So it's also filling that role as well, which we're hugely excited about. The TSX has now also been integrated into the federal government's corporate plan for the Department of Environment. This is a pretty brave move. So this is really now the federal government using the TSX, this objective measure of biodiversity trends, to assess how they're going in our initiatives for biodiversity conservation. And I'd like to applaud them for doing so, using this objective evidence base for their decision making. The other reason why the TSX is important is it gives us information about the effectiveness of management. And before the TSX, we really didn't have any synthesis of how management was influencing biodiversity trends in this country. So this is a trend for mammals within the TSX, and we can break these data sets up into sites that are actively managed for conservation and sites where there's no known management. They're effectively unmanaged. And the TSX shows that when we are investing in conservation, as you can see on the left-hand side there, we can stabilise threatened species populations. And indeed, some recover very strongly under that regime of management. Things that we've known for a long time, but this is really bringing it all together and demonstrating it. And so it's really crucial evidence base in terms of the effectiveness of management. If you'd like to know some more about this, there was a paper published earlier this year by Aisha Talik and co. That really digs into the impacts of management further for Australia's threatened and near-threatened mammals. We have this data for plants as well, and whilst it doesn't show the same level of recovery for mammals, you can see that in managed sites, there is a slower rate of decline and perhaps even a hint of recovery in the most recent years of data, whereas on managed sites, the trends are still steeply downwards. So management makes a difference, and the TSX can demonstrate that. Okay, so I'm very quickly going to run you through the trends from our last release in 2022. So what was new in 2022? We added 8 genera, so we did a big data call across the country. We got data for 8 new genera and 24 new taxa. Species as diverse as the alligator river yellow chat, the delicate Pomoderus, We got a huge data set on southern right whale monitoring from Victoria that spans back to the 1980s. So some really significant data sets came in. And overall, we gained another 625 time series from around the country. A strong coastal bias, and that relates to large amounts of shorebird data coming in last year. Okay, so what are the headline trends from last year's release? So 278 taxa represented, almost 20,000 time series. This is the trend across all groups. The blue line is the average, the grey is our error margin, and 1 means no change from the baseline, which is 1985. Overall, you can see a very significant decline, over 50% decline since 1985. For the different groups, birds were similar to the overall trend, a decline of around about 58%. For mammals, not such a significant decline, 20%, and you can see via those error margins that at some sites, species are doing quite well indeed. So that line, that grey region above 1 is recovery. So some of those populations are doing very well. For plants, the story is not so good. So a 77% decline in the plants that we have in the index. They're all from southern Australia. So a very steep and linear decline over recent years. In terms of, well, one of the nice things about the TSX is that you can dig down into different functional groups. So just quickly for birds, steep declines in shoreline migratory birds are ongoing, and some evidence of quickening of pace of declines in terrestrial birds. For mammals, some extraordinary recovery. So southern right whales, humpback whales doing very well. Some stabilisation in our terrestrial mammals, and that is particularly so in our critical weight range mammals, which is very encouraging. Yeah, we can see a stabilisation of that group, still at a lower abundance than the base year, but stabilising. In terms of the plant index, some evidence of very strong declines in herbaceous plants and shrubs, and very erratic patterns in orchids. So what does this new release of the TSX tell us? Firstly, that we're not turning the tide as yet. We're still seeing overall strong declines continuing, and that's same trend has been happening since the year 2000. There's certain groups that are key focus, so terrestrial birds, herbaceous plants and shrubs. And when you know a bit about the data that underlies the TSX, it aligns with where we know species are most at threat in this country. So the southeast and southwest in our agricultural regions, and where our population density is highest, are key foci. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to burn through this, I'm afraid. The things that we're doing now to grow the TSX, we're updating our management interface with some help from James Watmuth at Plantical. So what we're doing is adding new functionality to our interface. And we've produced a training manual and tutorials to run people through how to use the interface. So in building the functionality, we're hoping that it'll be much easier for people to get their data into the index and to use it for their purposes. We're also releasing a threatened bird index at the end of this year, so keep an eye out for that. And we'll be bringing in our Type 2 data, which is survey data from across the country. And we're also introducing new groups. So amphibians and reptiles are incoming. We've done a literature review to identify the data sets that we have. We've got data for about 60% of frogs, not so many of reptiles at this stage, only about 16%. And that's where those data sets come from. The next to come in is frogs. We've got a data call underway at the moment. So if you have any threatened frog data or near threatened frog data, please reach out to us. We'd love to chat to you. Okay, I better finish up. But thanks so much for your time, and reach out to us when you can. Ta.
Good morning, I'm Donald Hobern, the project manager for EcoAssets. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm located, the Ngunnawal people, and to pay my respect to their elders past and present. EcoAssets was a 2-year project with co-investment from the Australian Research Data Commons to enable the Atlas of Living Australia, the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, and the Integrated Marine Observing System to provide structured data to support the work of State of the Environment authors for the 2021 report, particularly focusing on improving the usefulness of species distribution data and summarizing levels of survey and monitoring effort for various kinds of Earth features around the country, including the marine regions. The pipeline for managing the data, which has been implemented as a set of R scripts, included taking all of the aggregated species occurrence data that feeds from all 3 infrastructures into the Atlas of Living Australia and producing an aggregated faceted summary that I'll show you in just a moment, and from that producing some more specific targeted summaries that reflected the specific needs of the SOE authors, and additionally bringing together metadata from TERN and IMOS monitoring activities and from summary information on some of the more standardized sample events such as vegetation surveys and bird counts within the Atlas of Living Australia to highlight where and when around the country different kinds of earth science features were monitored or surveyed, so that variation in this can be recognized and measured. And to support this, we also developed a vocabulary based on NASA's Global Change Master Directory vocabulary to organize in a hierarchical way the earth science features that were observed. And again, from this, we produced both marine and terrestrial summary data on the levels of effort. This is a view of one of these data products. In this case, it's the part of the entire aggregated data set for Australian species occurrences. It includes a number of spatial facets, the year, some facets that indicate interest to the policymakers or to researchers in terms of the bioregion, the protection status, whether or not a species is native, and indicates in each row for this this region and this time exactly how many occurrences there were within the overall data, and tallying up these, producing pivots effectively to remove some of the detail, makes it possible to look at changes in time and or variation in space in the numbers, for example, of threatened species recorded only outside protected areas within particular bioregions. As an example of such a pivot, this is a very, very simple view looking across 120 years at the number of species that had been recorded by each date that in each region would be considered to be introduced from outside Australia. And quite clearly and expectedly, the numbers rise continuously throughout the period, more and more introduced species, and particularly rise very sharply in the last 20 years, which reflects the massive growth in digital photography, citizen science, and other changes in how biodiversity is recorded. The inclusion of facets such as human observation versus preserved specimen within the data allows some of the complications of these signals to be extracted and for the user to compensate for them in various ways. As mentioned, the other primary focus was to summarize where different kinds of monitoring and survey effort had been conducted. So for many TERN sites, this combines a range of climate indicators, soil horizons, characterization of land surface, vegetation, different biodiversity survey activities, etc. For the marine environment, IMOS, through the Australian Ocean Data Network, presents many data sets that include significant mapped data for ocean temperature, chemistry, and also for biodiversity. And as mentioned, also the bird survey and other biodiversity survey activities are summarized for all the dates where we have evidence that somebody conducted a more standardized survey. And on the right, you can see a portion of the vocabulary that we've derived in order to provide a hierarchical organization of these data. And again, this data asset, the resulting data asset, is available for download as a comma-separated product. All of the EcoAssets data products can be accessed through the EcoAssets website at ecoassets.org.au. You will need to log in to download them, but no further information is really required. We're just wanting to be able to report to ARDC and others on usage of these data assets. I'd like to acknowledge again that this project was made possible through a co-investment from ARDC, and that it relied on significant input and support from many staff through all the partner organizations. But in particular, I'd like to thank Sandia from the Atlas of Living Australia's Science and Decision Support Team, who performed the data analysis and wrote the R scripts, which are available in the ALA GitHub repository, to maintain the data streams that feed those data sets. We've published the initial versions of each data asset and will shortly be publishing a second revised version, and then intend to keep doing so each year in preparation for the State of Environment Report 2026. Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, I'm Donald Hobern.
Hi, I'm Peter Johnson. I'm from the Department of Environment and Science. The work I'm presenting today I was done collaboratively with Brad Ellis, also from the department, where our team sits in a group called Protected Area Analysis. And I suppose the work we're presenting is more towards the decision-making end of evidence for environmental decisions. A lot of the talks we've seen so far are more about gathering the evidence. So yeah, basically the information we produce feeds in. It was initially, initially developed for selecting new protected areas, but it's also being used for how to manage them and all sorts of things now. So it's basically we don't gather any primary data. We're quite fortunate. We've got some excellent data sources to use. The core of what we do is based on Queensland's regional ecosystem mapping produced from the Queensland Herbarium. And more recently, we've been incorporating a lot of species mapping. But yeah, I'm going to presume most people here have heard of Comprehensive Adequate Reserve System, the IUCN guidelines for how we should be progressing protected areas. And so a lot of what we've seen up until recently has been focused on representation, making sure that we can tick a box to say we've got this in a protected area, whereas we've tried to swing a little bit more towards thinking about adequately protecting those things that we want to see in protected areas. And fortunately for us in Queensland, we've since the 90s we've had the Vegetation Management Act, which gives us a bit of an indication as to how much we should worry about. It's not geared towards protected areas, but basically it's got some turning points in it. So that's the curve there. On the left-hand side, you're looking at our smallest ecosystems, and if it's under 10,000 hectares, then it's always something to worry about. Whereas for really big ecosystems, we start calling them threatened, either of concern or endangered, once they drop below 30%. So we've used that curve for protected areas to basically say if we've protected above that solid line, the curve, oh, sorry, this goes in all sorts of ways when I don't know. But yeah, if we've protected above that curve, then we don't need to worry about those protecting more of those regional ecosystems, whereas if we're below it, then we should still worry. So for some of those ecosystems, we will always look to protect them, but for the big ones, we stop scoring them once we get up to a certain point. And so from that sort of perspective, what we can look at around the state, so the next few maps that we're going to look at, they're carved up with our cadastral boundaries. So it will draw your eye to the biggest properties in the state. Obviously, as you move from west to east, there's about 6 orders of magnitude in what size transaction we might be talking about if we were to purchase a property. And so that restricts what can and can't be represented in a single property. That's just the nature of the beast. We can certainly do the same work for any area of interest, but most of what we do is cadastrally based. And so we can look at how much any given property anywhere in Queensland would contribute underrepresented regional ecosystems. If you like, the academic literature mostly talks about this sort of a concept as complementarity. And so we've got our 7-point scale there, which is half order of magnitude steps in the scale. So there's massive difference between the lighter coloured properties and the darker coloured properties. But we go a bit further than that. We also look at how much of that representation can only happen on a given property. So there are some properties where entire ecosystems are only located on the property, is the extreme case, and then there's plenty of others where you'd need a certain amount of what's on the property in order to make that representation. Notably, you can see very clearly where Queensland's deforestation front is, and so as you move into that, you are talking lots and lots of small properties. You can see the yellow colour there through Brigalow Belt. So those are Queensland's bioregions under the Veg Management Act, which are a little different to the IBRA ones. Brigalow Belt North and South, for example, are one thing in Queensland. But you can basically see there where our most threatened regional ecosystems exist in small amounts over lots of property, so no individual transaction does a great deal, but all of those bits are irreplaceable. We can't do the job without them. And as we'll see later on, for some ecosystems, the job is well past being able to be done. And then finally, we have what we're calling urgency. Basically, there's been, most of our land clearing in Queensland is driven by demand for agriculture and to a lesser extent urban extension, and that's actually quite predictable. It's the same kinds of landscapes that get targeted for those activities. And because of that, we can use the previous loss of regional ecosystems to give us a bit of an idea about how much we can expect them to be lost in the future or how much demand there will be for clearing them. And we combine that with how underprotected they are to come up with how underprotected they are to come up with an idea of urgency and where we can do something about it. And so those are the 3 core ecosystem metrics that we provide to our decision makers. Obviously, in an ideal world, you do the most urgent things first, but given that our only public-facing performance measure is land area based, we tend to, if we're lucky, we tend to start at the green map, and hopefully we influence people to look at the other ideas. And we'll look a little bit more at how that happens on the ground a bit further along. And so we're right, we've taken a bookkeeping approach to the way we manage all of this. So we've got a spatial relational database where we can keep track of every single one of our regional ecosystems and the priority species that we'll get to. And as the routine updates come through from the Queensland Herbarium, we can look at changes. So this is all the regional ecosystems in the wet tropics bioregion. We can look at the corner cases basically to get a bit of a feel of what the spread is. So in our best case, in the bottom left corner, you've got ecosystems where we've protected everything we want to protect. In the top left, there's everything we want to protect is still out there in the landscape, but we haven't actually done any of it yet. And then finally, in the top right is our worst case scenario where it's almost all gone and we haven't protected it. Really, those are the spread. The wet tropics is a great example of having pretty much everything on the go. What's interesting about the wet tropics is, even though we've got a 17% land area target for Queensland still in place that we're aiming for. We've currently protected a bit over 8%. IUCN standard is 30% at the moment. Wet tropics actually is well above, so it's got 50% of the land area protected, but we still have a massive range of ecosystems where certain types of ecosystems are really well protected. Basically, if you're on the side of a mountain, you're pretty safe. But if you're on the tablelands where it's nice and flat and great for agriculture, or if you're on the lowlands, you're up in the other corner. And so, yeah, obviously there's a line there. Any given hectare can go hopefully one way or the other. But usually we don't see things coming out of protect and getting cleared. So we'd like to think once it's cleared, it's safe. Once it's protected, it's safe. But once it's cleared, we've got problems. And so really that's what the idea of those metrics is. We can start trying to steer decision making towards those things that really need to do, that are going to make the biggest difference, as opposed to those things that are easiest to do, which is probably where our legacy of protected areas comes from. And I suppose looking backwards a little bit to our previous set of IUCN metrics, I don't know if everyone's familiar with them, but one of the key ones for representation was to say, oh, we want to see 80% of regional ecosystems protected. So if we looked around the state's bioregions, if we were to use that 2020 metric, which is where the red line is, it kind of looks like we were doing okay, even with only 8% of the state protected. But if we put in the idea of some form of adequacy underneath that, and really for those metrics we're looking at, you'd like to see things well protected, which is in that bottom purple category. There's very, very few ecosystems at which you could safely say are adequately protected. We can say that they're protected to the extent that where they're not going to be threatened. And so, yeah, we can look at that across the state. If we pull all of those thresholds together and say, well, our perfect protected area system would see every ecosystem protected to that threshold. We can look at how that's split across our public and private protected areas. So we've got both programs running in Queensland. The grey area obviously is the unprotected bit where we could still get out there and do something about it. Whereas, yeah, we've got basically the red section where we've got ecosystems that have been lost below that level that we would have liked to have seen them adequately protected to. In some cases, there is regrowth, recovering landscapes, and hopefully carbon markets, that sort of thing, will start to see that red slice come back from the other end, but we're certainly a long way from seeing anything meaningful happen there for the size of Queensland. And then we present this information right down at property level. So I mentioned before there's biases in what our protected area system looks like, and that does happen right at kind of every level of decision. So first and foremost, we try to hit the guys on the ground with information that they can use when they're negotiating, whether that be negotiating a covenant, a private protected area, or whether it's negotiating to buy land, because quite often there'll be, while we've divided this up across the cadastre, quite often there'll be possibly the idea of subdivision or a covenant only covering part of the property. And invariably those decisions in the past have always gone the same way, where a landholder will look at his block of land and it'll go, there's the stuff I make the most money out of, the alluvials, the flat country. I've got this rocky stuff up the back, or the hilly stuff where I don't make as much money, so you can have that, I'll keep this. But doing that over and over again across the state, and the pattern's really evident when you start digging at it, means that if your threatened species are attached to the productive land, which is quite often the case, they're getting missed. And similarly, those ecosystems that are dependent on those parts of the systems are the ones we're less likely to get in protection. So we're now at least giving the guys on the ground tools to be able to walk up to a property and just say, well, if we're not getting that most important bit, is this really the deal we want to be making? We can look at each of the ecosystems on the property to see how they go. We carve up threatened species data in a similar way. It's a little bit harder to use. Unfortunately, we've had to make a bit of an amalgam of data sets from all sorts of bits and pieces, but we're finally in a place where we can do similar things for threatened species as what we're doing for regional ecosystems. Thank you.
So today we'll be looking at how the Commonwealth Government is using the habitat condition assessment system. But before I jump into that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting today and pay their respects to elders past, present and emerging. So the Australian government has a long-term goal to improve the trajectory of our environment through evidence-based conservation and restoration of our native species and ecosystems. We recognise that habitat condition and landscape connectivity are essential metrics because good quality, intact and connected habitat are all essential for native species persistence. But our early attempts at being able to report against Australia's condition have generally been at fairly coarse scales, class-based and reliant on expert opinion, making them fairly difficult to repeat and actually be consistent across various reports. Our more current methods are more well developed, but generally focus on local and site scale assessments. And so this goal will actually require national scale information on our landscape's ability to report on the capacity of biodiversity. So the Habitat Condition Assessment System, there will be actually a full presentation on this tomorrow in session 6, so I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of what the model is. But essentially, it's a semi-automated remote sensing approach to whole of landscape condition assessment, and it's been jointly developed between the department and CSIRO since 2015. So it's Australia's first nationally consistent and repeatable approach to habitat condition assessment. And it's got 3 core inputs. So the 3 core inputs are remote sensing data. So this time series for version 2.1, which is the one that's currently public, is 2001 to 2018, so an 18-year time series at a 250 metre resolution. We also have environmental abiotic data, such as the TERN soil grid, long-term climate layers, and we're also looking at reference sites. So these are areas that represent our least modified examples of ecosystem types. What HCAS does is it integrates these 3 data sources to compare how a pixel appears or is actually observed by remote sensing to what we would predict it to look like if it was in unmodified or if still in reference condition, so unchanged. So there are a series of outputs that are available, so various condition layers, trend information, uncertainty, as well as the reference site locations, and a whole report that details the actual model and the limitations. But what we're focusing on today is that my area of the department, so the environmental data and analysis area, is responsible for enriching the data that we have available for decision making and reporting across the department. So we've been looking into using HCAS across several applications, which we've already done, as well as developing analytical tools that actually sit on top of the HCAS so the department can use the information more wisely. So some examples that we've already implemented, you may have seen in the land chapter of the State of Environment report, HCAS scores were used to actually look at the modification levels of remnant ecosystems, as well as the bioregional averages used to classify Australia into 3 land use types, so intensive, extensive, and relatively natural. We've also been using it in our annual corporate report since 2020 under the Environment and Heritage outcomes alongside the Threatened Species Index that was mentioned previously. And it's also been used in our experimental ecosystem accounts with HCAS scores combining with expert elicited condition to actually assess the condition of each ecosystem type by modification state. Further to that, we've also been looking at developing data sets that use HCAS as an input, as well as several analytical tools and analyses. The first one being in collaboration with CSIRO and the New South Wales Government, we've updated our National Connectivity Index to version 2.0, where HCAS is the core input. And it basically reports on the context in which a location exists as opposed to the condition of that location. And it's a score for any given location as a measure of the amount of connected habitat, so proximity and condition, around that location. So this is also being used in our annual corporate report alongside the condition score itself. One of our tools that we've been using is the habitat condition across matters of national environmental significance, and because that's a really long name and the Commonwealth loves acronyms, we call it HCAM. So this is a conservation prioritisation tool that integrates the HCAS data with our spatial distributions of threatened species and ecosystems to help inform priorities for protection and restoration. So we're already using this as one of the tools to support the evaluation of options for land care service provisions in natural resource management regions. And we have another tool, which is the Area of Interest dashboard, showing the HCAS baseline and trend data for user-defined areas, against comparison sites, and we've provided a report to the NIAA to help them investigate the effectiveness of IPAs for their review this year using this dashboard. So those two examples of tools are not currently publicly available yet, but if there is broader interest, we would look into providing them. And lastly, we also do bespoke analytics to enhance the information suite that people have available for decision making. So this is an example where HCAS was used alongside koala information to help identify priority areas for restoration and protection. So another note is that this work did start prior to the release of the Nature Positive Plan, but the plan does provide us a framework that informs the work we're doing and ensure that we actually align all of our work with our department's future direction. We are looking to communicate and support the appropriate use of the HCAS and partner with external organisations alongside CSIRO for the future improvement of this model. In terms of the model enhancements, we are currently have work underway with CSIRO to look into the possibility of doing annual product releases, producing finer scale outcomes. So looking at getting finer spatial resolution from remote sensing and the environmental abiotic data, improving our reference site selection and how many we are able to incorporate into the model, and having an improved quantification of the model certainty. We also recognise that this isn't the end of the story, so there's a lot more that can be done. So we are looking at how we can integrate this information with other biodiversity data to actually better track biodiversity change. And we're looking into the potential to use HCAS as a data set to inform our key priorities under the Nature Positive Plan. So this may include things like the nature repair market and regional planning. So thank you very much, that's everything. I'll just quickly note that the two QR codes, one is the CSIRO data access portal where you can actually download the data set. So this is freely available. And the other takes you to a web app that has the HCAS if you're interested in playing with it right now. Maybe listen to the other presentations first. Thank you.
All right, so I'm Nicolas Rakotopare. I'm the Science Communication and Media Specialist for TERN, and I'll be talking a little bit about science communication, video, and towards the end explaining a little bit how I look at data to inform what we're going to do with our video strategy. There we go. All right, so it's science communication and videos in science communication is quite a broad topic now, so it's not just about a single project anymore. So often people used to come in and be like, we're just going to do one video or think about one video at a time, but it's something way more broad nowadays. And you can communicate the work of your science organization, the people working there, and one project, if you really think about it ahead, can lead to a range of content adapted for separate platforms. And you can both communicate internally and externally. So all those points are, again, to highlight it. It's quite a broad topic now, and we've really shifted away from this mindset of like, let's just do one video for one specific topic, because if you think about it, you can do a lot more. So you can plan ahead to maximize your output. So again, a common issue in science communication is the lack of custom and tailored visual content. So I've been to a few networking events this year, talking to other science communicator in Queensland. And one issue that comes up all the time when we do roundtables is like, we don't have the content, we don't have the visuals to really enhance the stories and be able to like provide better pictures and other things like that. So it's something that you really should be thinking about. And I'll be going through some of those issues that I know from experience, and again, talk about the data aspect of it later. But I've been in that space for a while, and that is coming back a lot. So hopefully you can take a few points from that presentation. So it's about planning ahead. You really want to sit down and think about how can videos enhance your science communication strategy, because it's not there to replace text or the traditional science communication, but it's there to work along. And video is a huge part of internet. Cisco usually release a white paper every 3 years talking about how much video is going to be in part of the global internet usage. And for 2022, the number was 82%. So it's really growing a lot, but not just in terms of social media, in terms of everything, in all aspects. So the way we look at it as well is we sit down, we look at on what platform we're going to put the content on, and how we can maximize the presence of someone like me on the field or on a specific project. So we don't just look at that specific project, but we go ahead and we're like, all right, we're going to that location to capture that content, but what else can we do at the same time to build our digital assets? And so it's also about finding platforms that make sense for your organization and really looking at where you should be putting your content. So one of the big things is to bring faces to your organization. It helps a lot sort of to build trust with your community. And so short videos about what your staff are doing, specific projects, work really well both internally and externally. If you have a large organization, those videos, so we are aiming at the moment to put one every newsletter out, profiling one of the TERN staff. And they've been really well received both externally and internally because people learn more about the projects and all the capacities we have in-house. But because we're a big organization, people that work in other parts of the country actually get to know like each other through those short videos. And we've had some good feedback. So I'll put a bit of a short compilation of the videos that we've done sort of so far with Arun, Beth, and Andrew. So one a month, and again, they've worked really well. And you'll see they're very simple, but sort of high production value videos that we can repurpose for a range of platforms as well.
Yeah, my name is Arun, and I'm a research data analyst with the TERN Data Services and Analytics team here at UQ Brisbane. I manage the research data portal along with a couple of other ecologists. So primarily we get data from different data sources, be it the TERN surveillance data, then there's this flux data, then there's vertebrate and fauna surveys from different sources, and we also have external contributors.
And I'm a project support officer in the protocols team at TERN. On the day-to-day, I write protocols. When we're in the field, we get to do a lot of testing of our protocols that we write. My favourite has been science testing, where we go along the transect and count the number of poos that we come across. We're trying...
My name's Andrew Topmakoff. I'm a technical lead at TERN Ecosystem Surveillance in Adelaide. I work with the internal development team here in Adelaide and also with the developers up in Queensland with the data systems and analytics team. Also working with external stakeholders.
Short examples of like what we've been doing to sort of put our name in that space. Again, so one video project can really lead to a range of content adapted for separate platforms. And what I mean for that is that you don't just do a video anymore and just put it everywhere at the same time. You really think ahead and you have to adapt your content for all the different platforms to really maximize all the time, effort, and money you've put into that specific project. And you can really reach a wide audience by, again, hosting your video on social media, YouTube, and the website. Having things all across the board really can, again, boost your reach and the awareness of your organization, your brands, and your projects. Video tutorials are something that are like high in demand as well, and for new products that you might be releasing, or people always want the written version, the PDF version, the report, the project, but they also want to have a video to be able to look at that. And video deliverables are part of grants are increasing a lot. So over the past few years, there's often been grants that require you to deliver some form of summary in video or some form of tutorials in video or just some video communication work of that project. So it's really important to be looking at those things. So it's great, again, that's your more classic ones, project and collaboration showcase. And so this is two examples of the videos we've done in the past few months. And again, I'll put a little compilation afterwards, but you gotta bear in mind as well that those videos, I went there, I shot, but when I go, for example, to film when TERN partnered with Emerita at their launch, there is a lot more content that can be done, and by knowing who's going to be there, who's working on what, and who's collaborating with who, we can really get even more content out of that, filming something at that time that we might need in a year's time. So by doing all of that, sort of planning ahead and knowing exactly what you want to do and what's happening across the organization, you can really maximize your content, and you shift away from that. We have one video, it's done, and it's sitting there. You really get there, and you have so much that you can do with all the content. Nope.
Samples purely due to its distance away from any sort of sealed road. In both winter and then even in the summer, it's just a long drive. basically over a rugged environment.
At each site we have what we call an AMON station, the Australian Mountain Observation Network, and those are collecting lots of standard micrometeorological variables: light, temperature, wind speed, precipitation, humidity, all those sorts of things. In addition, they're measuring snow depth, and then we also...
So we're here today to launch TERN's soil and herbarium collection, based here at the Wake campus of the University of Adelaide. The collection here stores 4 types of environmental samples. So we store vegetation voucher samples, we store vegetation tissue samples for a variety of uses, and we store 2 types of soil samples as well.
From that last video, there is probably 6 to 10 different video products we can get out of that one visit, because I spent some time with the soil team, spent some time with the plant team, just getting extra interviews, extra footage. We've repurposed that for vertical content as well, but we really sat down and looked at, again, to maximize the visit to one site. And as you saw with the previous, because I get the question a lot about people saying it's easier to showcase like field projects and things, which is true, but I had good chats with modelers yesterday, because I often get the question, but we do modeling, it's not, you know, koalas in the forest. But we still can do a lot. As you could see with Arun's video, it's about sitting down and really looking at what they're doing and what can be shown visually as well. There's a story in every project. And so in turn, what that does is that it helps build the video asset, and that's what we've been doing since I joined just under a year ago, and really building everything so that we have this repository of in-house high-resolution footage and photos that we can use and reuse and pitch and put in a lot of different projects. Because again, I'm really trying to sway away from this one project, one video, we're done approach. It's one project to continuously build our digital assets, and it's something that I've seen a few other organizations do, and it's really paying off in the long run. So it's a lot about internal, external video content as well. The internal video training work really well. Things that processes that you might have and that you might need to onboard new staff and things like that. Video work really well for that. And similarly with external training video for science and ecosystem products. So I spent a fair bit of time with Jeff on the TSX and all the different video modules that you've seen before. We've shot together, we've screen recorded together, and we made it as high-end as possible so that people getting on the website can first get a short version just to see what a TSX is about and what sort of data they're looking for, but then also very detailed different videos for people that are uploading data to the TSX to help them navigate the spreadsheets and all the other things. So there's a range of things that you can do, again, trying to shift that mindset from just one video, one project. There's way more that we can do, and that's what we've been implementing. And again, as a large nationwide organization, staff video profile have been really helpful with that, and we're going to be rolling them out more and more. So this is just a short example of like what we've done as well with Jeff's sort of data visualizer and having like animation showing and being able to really provide all the help and again maximizes our chance of people using the product, understanding how it works, and getting the right things in their hands. So in summary, so the video is a very versatile tool, and so that's why I was hoping that people would get away from that talk, is that it can be tailored to the needs and audience. It's planning ahead to really like maximize your return on investment and building all those digital assets that are so much needed when it comes to promoting the project, bringing faces to the organization, showcasing the projects and building the assets, and incorporate the videos in all the aspects you can on your social media, your website, your newsletter, into your training. And so I don't have specific data yet, but what we've been doing as well is monitoring all the analytics that we can for the first year. So we're about to get to that year to see which parts of our video strategy works the best and sort of like funnel our efforts into that while still continuing growing the rest, but really tailoring that to what people really like to look on our social media website and other things. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Mahdi Taghadosi, or Mohammad Taghadosi, I am second-year PhD student at University of Technology, Sydney. We are actually a collaborative team from UTS, CSIRO, and James Cook University, and working on monitoring diurnal to seasonal vegetation dynamics with Himawari geostationary satellites. Well, unlike more conventional satellites, Himawari appears in a fixed position in the sky, always sitting in the same place looking at us. It has large area coverage, and it's ideal for continuous monitoring over a specific region. With its unparalleled high temporal imagery that gives us data every 10 minutes, it's actually a unique data set that Australian Bureau of Meteorology actually relies on it for high quality forecast products. It has actually revolutionized our understanding from ecological processes by tracking daily and sub-daily processes that include GPP, phenology, photosynthetic capacity, and light use efficiency. Well, actually, we are part of a TERN project that is dedicated for developing best practice Himawari data products for enhanced sub-daily monitoring of Australia's ecosystem. We are actually processing this data set and generating useful products for ecological community, the products that include GPP, evapotranspiration, ecosystem stress, and things like this. Our team has developed Himawari data sets in 3 phases. First of all, top of atmosphere data that is in 1 kilometers and 10 minutes. And then we have the atmosphere corrected surface reflectance data that is in 2 kilometers and 10 minutes data. And then we have the BRDF corrected surface reflectance data. Well, our UDS group has actually focused on vegetation dynamics and vegetation phenology for Australian biomes. Phenology actually is about the timing of vegetation growth life cycle. So using this Himawari data set with its 10 minutes repetitive imagery would be a great opportunity for phenological studies. So let's take a look at one of our first results. As you can see, this is one of the Aussie sites, a short plane. And the shaded regions that you can see, it's all 10 minutes observations for 5 years, such a huge amount of data. And then we generated the daily composite out of this data. We processed it, and as you can see, the dark green regions, the dark green in the first plot in DVI, and the purple one in the EVI2 shows the generated daily composite out of this data. That shows the very nice and clean vegetation profile that shows the wet and dry pulses. Even taking a look at a single observation around noon gives us a nice profile of this vegetation that shows the capability of Himawari dataset. We also compared this Himawari data with corresponding 8-day MODIS data, and there's a pretty good match, as you can see in MODIS data that is in black dots. There's a pretty good match with our Himawari dataset. One other thing about it is that it can be seen that there is a lot of detailed structure that can be seen in Himawari dataset that cannot be seen in MODIS. For example, in 4 or 5 months, there is only 3 or 4 points of MODIS datasets, but we have a detailed structure by Himawari data that is shown in purple. Let's take a look at the diurnal variation. That is one of these, this is the S-short plane flux sites across the wet and dry season. As you can see, in wet season, there is a detailed structure of the canopy here, can be seen. And then we have less structured data in dry season. Even the noise signals, as you can see in red dots, the one that fluctuates more, gives us information about cloud formation and information that is related to power and radiation. So all in all, these Himawari datasets provide great opportunity. Comparing the diurnal variation in 2 different oxiflux sites, one in estuary plain and the other one is Robson Creek, the rainforest biome, reveals that the diurnal profile is different among different biomes. In estuary plain, we compared these wet and dry season, as I described earlier. And in Robson Creek, that is a rainforest biome, we compared these two different timestamps. The one is September equinox, and the other one is summer period in February. Let's take a look at another flux site, another our study sites, Tumbarumba, the forested region. As you can see, the Himawa dataset can clearly shows this drought and fire disturbance, the period of black summer in late 2019. In both of our products of Himawari, the top of canopy and top of atmosphere, that is actually raw data, can be clearly seen. The black summer can be clearly seen. Comparing this MODIS dataset with Himawari reveals that there are a lot of detailed structure can be seen in Himawari dataset that cannot be observed in MODIS. It should be also noted that this MODIS dataset and Himawari dataset are not always the same in different biomes, in different study sites, and we need to go through it to see what is the differences. We also compared this top of canopy and top of atmosphere dataset, and that is one is with and one of is without atmospheric correction, and there is a pretty good match between these two, as you can see. This study site is our Alisa Spring, and one of our teammates is working on it. We also compared this Himawari dataset with flux tower measurements, the measurements that come from the flux GPP, evapotranspiration, water use efficiency, and we're working on it. And as a future direction, the data fusion, the combination of this geostationary satellites with especially dense observation from polar orbiting system can be considered. The multi-sensor fusion also can be considered, that can also be coupled with historical satellite data archive. And also with this availability of Himawari datasets, we can complete the development of phenological metrics and coupling with Himawari radiation products. I'll also give you the nice shot of this Himawari. First of all, this how Himawari actually look at us in Australia during the day. And this one is the a period of fire in Perth. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm not sure how to use this. Oh, great. I'm Eleanor Velasquez. I'm the Education and Training Manager at TERN. And I'm here to talk to you today about some findings from a workshop series I held late last year called the Vegetation Data Synthesis Challenge. But before I start, I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the lands in which I work, live and play, and which this series of workshops was undertaken, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. So the overarching scope of this series of workshops was for the Queensland Government, and it was funded under the Research Infrastructure Co-Investment Fund. And we decided in collaboration with partners in the government to focus in on vegetation data, as there was still some gaps and things that people wanted so that they could best answer environmental management questions and create policy decisions and regulation based on that data. So we got together 15 experts spanning a really broad diversity of people, so people from research, academics, research students, private sector, public sector, local and Queensland government, CSIRO and NRM groups. So the scope was vegetation data sources that we could really try and integrate within TERN's data discovery portal. And this is because there were still gaps in the data that the Queensland government stakeholders had identified as part of the initiation of the project.
And the research and environmental questions, I guess, could guide the prioritization of that data being ingested. And the final thing that we wanted to get from, I guess, the series of workshops is any roadblocks to sharing data that people might have. So what's going on? Why won't people share their data if they're not holding data but won't share it with us currently? So I just wanted to preface my talk a little bit with a purpose, because in Queensland, critical environmental impact assessment decisions, policy development, regulation, enforcement is still happening without all of the information. So the information is often out there, collected, but it's sitting in the USB drive in the bottom of someone's drawer, collecting dust, which is not ideal. And as someone, I should let you know that I worked for 10 years as a policy officer in Environment and Science Department. It keeps changing names, so I'm not going to try and reiterate all those name changes here, but it's really difficult to make those decisions and develop the best management frameworks and policy decisions when you don't have all the data available. Now, just to prove I'm not making this up, I just wanted to say that in the 2020 Samuel review of the EPBC Act, they also found these issues are a national problem. So Australia's natural environment is declining. I'm preaching to the converted, most likely here with this message. However, the data, information, and systems that bring that data together, we've still got work to do. So because you might be thinking, well, aren't we already doing this? Doesn't TERN hold a lot of data? No, we're still going. We still need to get more data into our systems. So the known unknowns for this series of workshops is that the data is not largely discoverable or freely available. So some of it is, but a lot of it still isn't. Why might this be the case? So data custodians may not know where to upload data or give us their data, or how to do this. There's a bit of a gap there in terms of if you're a PhD student, for example, coming into research, you're going to be doing a lot of data collection in that space of time that you're doing your PhD, but you're going to be rushing against the clock, and you might not realize that it might be a good idea to share that data at the end of your project so that other people can use it. And currently there are very few data agreements in place. So when you get a grant to do research or you're working in the government, there's no real incentive or mechanism causing that data to be reshared. So there may need to be a regulation change in that context. So as I said, this leads to the large data sets that have taken enormous amounts of time and money to collect being lost. And also the potential redundancy and duplication of that data because of the lack of knowledge about its existence in the first place. So we want to try and avoid this and use our money to collect data which hasn't already been collected. So what did we find as a result of these workshops with our amazing panel? We found that, yes, there is a lot of data being generated that is not currently within a facility like TERN. So we can still work in this space and try and get that data out there. The scarcity of data submitted is often, funnily enough, it's people in government, it's people in TERN resubmitting data to themselves. So that's good, but we can do better. And interestingly, I just thought I'd mention this. For the state of Queensland, people were really interested in forests. So people wanted to know about canopy height, diameter at breast height, tree hollows for critically endangered species such as greater gliders, and things like that. And local governments in particular highlighted a need for information or data being linked to remotely sensed products. For example, if I'm trying to manage weeds in a certain area, I've gone out there, I've sprayed some weeds last summer, I don't really want to send the field team out there again unnecessarily. If I could do this in a desktop way, that would be super awesome. And I'll just say, in terms of the data gaps, we did have some grassland ecologists in the room, but they still highlighted forests, which I thought was quite interesting. I'm not sure why that is. So I've mentioned some of these facts already. It's not obvious how data can be shared. I think I'm running out of time slightly, so I might just skip that one and go straight to this slide. So this is basically a diagram from the 2020 Samuel Review. So figure 9 is the current state. So this is where we're going a bit haywire. There's arrows going everywhere. Data's ending up in desk drawers all over the place. We then get to our ideal proposed future state, figure 10, which is everything that is nice and curated, and it looks really lovely, and that's where we'd like to get, and that's what I'm trying to lead in terms of TERN. So just as an example, post these workshops, I put out the call to 20 known data custodians to get their data, but I got a really low response rate. So 3 out of the 20. So 2 out of those 3 were early career researchers. Thank you to those who did. I think some of them are actually here today. Why might this be the case? I think that sometimes after we've been out in the field collecting data, we get a bit precious, a bit, I guess, protective of our data, and we end up looking a little bit like this. As a field ecologist, I can attest to that. It's a hard job, and the competitive nature of research and jobs these days does not help. So here is my very crude reinterpretation of the Samuel Review figures that I showed you in the previous slide. How can we get from our golem state in figure 9 and get our data with the veritable one ring into the Council of Elrond so that we're all sharing data and working together? So as an ex-policy officer, I really love carrots and sticks. And as an education and training manager, I guess I'm sort of, this is what I'm thinking. But I'd love to hear your thoughts if you want to chat later. So, and thank you to those who laughed. You'll get your payment at lunch. We can have education and training on fair and care principles. So just more general information out there in an easy to digest format. And this could be on the fair care. The other one that I had there in the carrot side is bespoke data sharing agreements. So it may not be obvious to everyone, or it certainly actually wasn't obvious to me when I was doing my PhD, that you can actually devise a data sharing agreement with some data custodians, and your data will not be shared willy-nilly. It will be shared in a very sensible and, I guess, well thought out approach. On the stick side, data collected using public money. Sorry, I'm just struggling with this. It's hard to see that one down there. Data collected using public money, for example, grant money, government projects, could be legislatively required to have that data reshared back to the funding body. The other one is compulsory training on fair care principles, possibly via regulation, as I mentioned before. And this really cute one, I tried to find a cool pic of like a stick disguised as a carrot, but that's the best I could do. I heard of this awesome example from a colleague. Some HDR students, so that's PhD and master's students at UNSW, were required to complete some modules on data sharing, on fair principles and care principles prior to commencing their PhD, so they were already using that language. And it helps us to get along our way in the journey. So I think I'm out of time. I'm done, but happy to chat later.
Hello everyone, thank you. I'm Jenny Wang from University of South Queensland and the Center for Applied Climate Science. This is a sorry. Okay. So our topic is about applying alternative risk transfer solutions to synergize climate change mitigation and adaptation. So this is a co-work with our colleagues, and so it is still in the preliminary stage. So hope to get your valuable comments and suggestions. So we also thank the funding from our DCAP and the ECA project. So as we know that climate change has generated significant adverse impacts to the society, economics, and the environment. So to reduce this impact, we propose an integrated framework so to improve agricultural resilience and reduce disaster recovery costs through alternative risk transfer solutions. For this solution, at the moment, we propose is weather parameter related insurance. And at the same time, so there's a framework to also increase the carbon sequestration to mitigate climate change and as well as increase nature capital and the biodiversity by encouraging the forest coverage. This is our proposed framework. We take the Australia as case studies. This is because Australia is a global key agriculture producer and is also subjected to frequent and damaging climate disasters such as flooding and drought. And at the same time, Australia has substantial amounts of marginal land and also has established a good carbon credit scheme. So our this framework includes several components. Firstly, government need to provide suitable enable conditions to producers and other financial institutions such as insurance industry. And then under these enabling conditions, and our farmers can dedicate to the their marginal land to the carbon sequestration. Through this insurance industry, this marginal land can be aggregated to the to an economically viable scales, and then they can sell this carbon credit from the carbon sequestration to our government through the clean energy restriction. And at the same time, investment measurement, regulation, and the monitor is required to make sure we really realize the carbon sequestration. And finally, the producers can use this sold carbon credit to as the proceeds for revenue to purchase insurance, agriculture insurance for the premium. Finally, if the farmers can use this revenue as to purchase insurance, this insurance and following can be used to another strategies method to help them reduce the impact from climate change for their commercial farming. So this is our framework. So this framework arises from various drivers of different stakeholders. These include, but not limited, we say from the government and the society, this is a requirement from national, international agreement. For example, Kyoto Protocols and Paris Agreement. There's a 2 degrees temperature requirement before the pre-industry levels, and also required by the government budget stress to recover the damage for disasters. And from the Environment and Ecosystem Service, this is required to meet the deforestation restrictions and biodiversity conversations. At the same time, from other national, international commitment. For the producers, normally we mention the farmers and the agriculture industry. Because they are required to enhance the climate variable change and they improve their productions and they reduce the loss. Finally, we will talk about insurance and the insurance companies. So this is their intention to increase their market size and performance at the same time to reduce the systematic risk. So this overall benefit from the framework that reduce the carbon emission to at the same time reduce disaster risk cost and also increase the climate resilience. So from the insurance part we use, because we use the special, we can say it's an innovative financial products, is called climate parameter index insurance. So this is different from our traditional insurance. This insurance is based on with the parameters. So just a lot of our presenters have shown the data. So this with the parameter data is also important to build up these innovative financial products. And so just finally, because this is a preliminary stage for our framework, so just try to finish this one. We propose this integrated concept framework, try to interface climate change mitigations and adaptations. And at the same time, this framework allows for coupling carbon sequestrations with agricultural climate insurance, and also it benefits agricultural farmers' financial situations, and also provide a broad environmental and economic benefits. So overall, our framework try to satisfy the sustainable development goals. I think the second goal is about sustainable agriculture, and the third goal is climate change. So thanks very much, and because it's still in the, as I said, in the early stage, I try to hope everybody and very valuable input. Thank you.
Right. Good to be here. Yep. That's forward. Right. Okay. Hello, everyone. So I'll just start by, I know I've probably don't have much time, so I won't dilly-dally too much. So just start by acknowledging the Palawa people from the local custodians of the land where I live and work down south of here, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and future. So my talk today is trying to do a bit of detective work to use TERN-enabled research to attempt to diagnose why the forests at Warra are so sensitive to warming temperatures, and from that knowledge, use that knowledge to inform how we might best manage future forests so they're more resilient. My background's in forest health, so this is our sort of our step-by-step way of dealing with health problems as we detect new ones and get through to management. It's a very sequential process, and it needs to be that way so you come up with the right answers and right management at the end. The key bits I'm talking about today are the diagnosis, the second step, and how that informs management towards the end, the development of management practices. Just a bit of a brief introduction, though, of the threat that we've detected. So it's using two independent approaches. The first was work done by Dave Bowman and others back in 2014, where he looked at growth rates in a whole range of forest inventory plots scattered right across temperate and subtropical Australia in moist situations where water was not limiting. And what Dave found was that growth rates peaked at relatively low temperatures, and as temperatures warmed, the productivity of the forest decreased. Then, more recently, some measurements I did down at Warra during a heatwave in 2017 found it was a record heatwave, one in 800-year event, which is probably going to become an annual event in the next few decades. During that heatwave, the forest switched from a strong carbon sink, where it was taking up lots of carbon, to a carbon source, losing carbon. So gross primary productivity of the forest dropped alarmingly. And it didn't seem to be associated with any sort of water limitation, so the forest was still quite moist. There was plenty of transpiration going on. So that's the threat we've diagnosed, that sensitivity and that response, sharp response to heat waves. The information I used to attempt the diagnosis came from two main sources. The first was site comparisons using time series data through heatwave events on super sites in non-water limited situations. So Tumbarumba, and that had a heatwave event during the angry summer in 2013. Wombat Forest, that had a heatwave event a year later. And Warra had a heatwave, the 2017 heatwave event. So they're the three heatwave events that these tall forests in non-water limiting periods experienced. The other studies I reviewed was more designed experiments, comparative studies using supersites, a number of supersites to compare responses to various ecophysiological traits. So there was work from the ecophysiological work from Owen Atkins' lab at ANU, and that was led by Keith Bloomfield when he did a postdoc there. Alison Bennett's PhD study at Melbourne University, and Jen Peters' PhD study at Western Sydney. Just to start with the evidence. So the contrasting carbon dynamics of the sites, the super sites that experience the heatwave events. Here I'm comparing just Wombat and Warra, but I'll point out that Wombat Forest showed a similar sort of, Tumbarumba showed a similar response to Wombat Forest during that heatwave event. I've partitioned the carbon into its three components: gross primary productivity, GPP, ecosystem respiration, ER, and net ecosystem exchange. And I'm comparing the average values of those three components in the heatwave period, the dark shaded bars, with the background period, which is a comparison period that had near average temperatures for the same time of the year. What we find consistently across the sites during the heatwave event was ecosystem respiration went up significantly. Net ecosystem exchange significantly changed from a sink, and that's below the bar, to a source for CO2 above the zero, so a positive value. And there the similarities ended, because at Wombat Forest and at Tumbarumba Forest, GPP didn't change during the heat wave. But at Warra, GPP significantly decreased during the heat wave event. So that's the unusual response. Apologies for graphs. I love them though. Looking at energy fluxes now. And this is how the extra energy that came in during the heatwave event was used. So I'm just showing on the left-hand graph, it's just average diurnal values of energy fluxes experienced at Warra during the heatwave event and the background period. The thing to note there is that the net radiation increased significantly during the heatwave event. You can see that through the day as the shaded area, the dark shaded area. That's the increase in energy that the site received during the heatwave event. Just about all of that extra energy that came in was dissipated as latent heat flux. So it just drove evaporation from the canopy of the tree. So latent heat flux was significantly elevated during the heatwave event. And we saw the same pattern at Wombat Forest and at Tumbarumba too. These are non-water limited sites, so they had plenty of water in the soil to keep on transpiring during that heatwave event. And that, again, where Warra, the similarity between Warra and the other sites ends. Because if you look on the right, I'm looking at canopy conductance now, which is really a surrogate of the average amount of resistance the canopy has to losing water. This is plotted for Warra. The thing to note there, the black bars, again, this is average diurnal, average hourly value through the day. The gross primary productivities is the black lines, and the solid black line is the heatwave period. The dashed line is the background period, and you can see through the middle hours of the day, gross primary productivity drops sharply during the heat wave. So there's plenty of sunlight, but that's when the daytime temperatures are at their peak. What you can also see in the blue lines, this is canopy conductance in the heatwave period and the background period. They're not changing, so there's no change in canopy conductance during the heatwave compared with the background period, and that is unusual. wombat forest, even though latent heat flux increased during the heat wave, it still reduced its canopy conductance because vapour pressure deficit, the atmospheric dryness, was much higher at Wombat than it was at Warra during the heat wave. So, taking my first tentative steps to the diagnosis, the distinctive response at Warra, we can say water limitation is not contributing to the heat wave response. We can also say that atmospheric dryness is not contributing to the heat wave response. So if we can take from that the tolerance of drought conditions is probably not going to be a useful adaptive trait for increasing the resilience of the future forest to heat waves at Warra. Now I'm looking at response to warmer temperatures, and this is Alison Bennett's work from her PhD. What I've done here is I've taken one of her graphs which plots the relationship between gross primary productivity and air temperature for 17 Ausflux sites around Australia. And I'm focusing just on the temperate forest sites, the ones that are in that green shaded area. And the thing to note there, the 4 temperate forest sites, is that the apex of the parabola, the optimum temperature for productivity, are pretty similar across the 4 sites. There's not much difference. But what is different, and you look at the parabola for Warra compared with the others, is that Warra, the productivity declines much more quickly away from the apex than the other sites. So the sensitivity to departures from optimum temperature is much stronger at Warra than the other sites. So, take the next step of diagnosis. Temperature optimum alone for temperature optimum for GPP alone is not contributing to the heat wave response. And therefore increasing temperature optimum alone is probably not going to be a useful adaptive trait for increasing the resilience of the heat wave events. So bringing together our first 2 steps of the diagnosis, drought tolerance and increasing drought tolerance and increasing temperature optima are not useful traits for selecting for greater resilience. Climate, and from that, the main approach often used for dealing with adaptation, main adaptation response is climate-adjusted providencing, where you assist the migration of providences that are analogues for the future climate of an area. That's probably not going to work very well at Warra in that tall forest. Now, another thing I wanted to look at was acclimation. Can the existing forest adjust to changing conditions? And this is from a body of work done by Ling Zhu, one of the PhD students in the Atkins lab. And she looked at how the temperature dependence of photosynthesis and respiration varied with the season. So she was looking at super sites, so she did her studies on 6 super sites. And if you're looking for evidence of acclimation, you'd see, for example, in the winter, you'd see respiration at a temperature, respiration became more efficient. The forest was adjusting to being more efficient at respiration at a lower temperature. And conversely, in the summer, it's the optimum, the critical temperature photosynthesis, because it's hotter, would probably be upregulated to cope with the hotter conditions. What Ling found was for most of the super sites, and 4 of the 6 in particular, there was significant upregulation of respiration in winter compared with summer. You can see those with the asterisks and the arrow pointing downwards to the right. Warra was the outlier. It was the only site which showed absolutely no acclimation to temperature of respiration to winter. The same thing with critical temperature for photosynthesis. There was no evidence of acclimation at Warra, whereas other sites showed strong acclimation to seasonal acclimation. And Ling Zing attributed that lack of response, lack of acclimation at Warra to the lack of radiation, the lower radiation in winter. There's just not enough radiation at winter to worry about trying to optimise your physiology. You may as well go to a holiday to Brisbane instead. So, next step of my diagnosis, low winter irradiance is linked to that lack of seasonal temperature acclimation. I'm proposing that lack of acclimation will translate to a general incapacity for temperature acclimation. That should be tested. And from that, I'm proposing that acclimation of the current generation of tall eucalypt forests at Warra to a warmer climate, it's unlikely. I'd also further add that low winter irradiation limits growing season to the non-winter months at Warra. Which brings us to this horrendous graph. This is looking at the temperature sensitivity of GPP, and I'm looking particularly at the A coefficient of the binomial model that Alison Bennett used to plot the temperature GPP response. The more negative the A coefficient, the steeper the slope away from the vertex is. So you can see on the right-hand graph, there's a whole lot of the Mediterranean woodlands, temperate forests and temperate woodlands up at low values of the A coefficient. And then as you move down, increasing the high values of the A coefficient, high negative values of the A coefficient are dominated by the tropical rainforests, the tropical savannas, and Warra. So what I did, taking the findings from the last bit of work, looking at the lack of seasonal acclimation because of low winter irradiance, let's forget about what the temperatures are like in the winter and drop them out of our temperature range for Warra and just look at the temperature range during the period where it can actually grow, so the warmer months. And do that for all the other sites. In the other temperate sites, they can make use of the conditions, growing seasons all through the year, so they can actually be carbon positive during the middle of winter if it's because it's generally cooler. So Cumberland Plains make good use of that, for example. Look at the annual temperature range, whether it's a full annual temperature range or restricted annual temperature range. So it's a full range for the tropical rainforest and all the other Mediterranean and temperate forests. It's restricted range for the savanna forests and for Warra. The savanna because of the dry wet season and Warra because of the lack of winter irradiance. And you plot that and you get quite a strong relationship between the sensitivity of that A coefficient, that steepness of the slope, and temperature range. So a narrow temperature range is linked to high sensitivity to departures of growth, primary productivity departures from optimum temperature. So last step in the diagnosis, bringing in that low winter irradiance, restricting the growing season, leading to reduced temperature range associated with increased sensitivity of GPP, can account for that steep decline in GPP compared to the other sites and is contributing to that heatwave response. So sensitivity departures from temperature optima is a site-defining trait to be retained. We want to have that sensitivity retained because that's determining high productivity as well. So latitudinally determined temperature sensitivity is a trait to retain, and to do that, in situ adaptation via enhanced natural selection is probably going to be the safest option for lifting the temperature optimum while retaining that high sensitivity to temperature, to temperatures around the optimum. So, just very briefly, TERN science is useful for pathologists. It's a very useful way for looking, particularly across cross-site comparisons, to look at distinctiveness of sites, distinctive responses. It's really used. The time series, looking through events, really useful. So that evidence from multiple lines of inquiries can usefully identify traits that are useful for designing management approaches. And from that, the evidence provided little support from the conventional approaches, which, by the way, the land managers were very keen to use, up until I poked my head in, of climate-adjusted provenancing. Rather, the evidence supports in situ adaptation via enhanced natural selection. And that's a significant shift in management focus. Just to finish off with some acknowledgements. Mainly Alison II, my tireless offsider for the whole time Warra's been in existence, has been wonderful. But we get ongoing support from the National Parks through the World Heritage Area and Sustainable Timbers Tasmania. Thank you. And here or there?
Thank you very much to all of the speakers in that session. I'd invite all of the speakers to come up to the chairs here. Invite you to take chairs here. And Tim, very pleased that you were able to make it for the session. We'd almost written you off just in time. And thank you very much to the audience who've posted questions here. There are, in fact, quite a number. Some of them are quite specific to individual speakers. But what I'd like to do is choose some of the high-level questions that might be applicable to a number of the speakers and get some response on those to start off with. So this is a question to all of the panel, and you can all speak or pass if you feel that it's not you. But the question is, well, recognition of the incredible effort that collectively has gone into bringing together some of these evidence bases, the geographic spread, the time spread, the thematic spread. Can we look at all of those together to provide a synthesis of where the gaps are? I know some of you have been looking at your individual gaps, but rising above that, identifying gaps in our knowledge and information. So who'd like to kick off with a comment on that one?
I think once we get into particularly dealing with extremes, climate extremes, and the high natural variability that we face in Australia, of how ecosystems react to variability and climate extremes. Individual events are generally pretty rare in only one place, so collecting evidence of getting an overall picture of how ecosystems respond to very rare events is best done by combining a whole lot of observations through time and space to get little snapshots of the different responses. So I think that's where TERN has great opportunity, but finding ways of capturing additional measurements, that tasked measurements to, and we talked about surveillance, for example, being a portal to go and get specific observations of areas that experience some extreme events, just to start to get observations, because it's the lack of observations which are generally driving our incapacity to make strong conclusions on what's going on with ecosystems during extreme events.
Thanks very much, Tim. Geoff, I think you had a response there.
Yeah, following on from that, I think we've got to a point now where we've got some amazing data products right across the spectrum. Amazing data and then analytical approaches to produce things like HCAS, for example. My thinking in terms of the gap now is that we need to bring those data sets together to bear on particular questions that we have about ecosystem processes and mechanics of ecosystem processes, and then predicting how they're going to respond to climatic events or management. So we've come up with a lot of great analytical tools to produce the individual data sets. I think it's time to really focus on analytical tools that link those together and build predictive models for assessing different management actions.
Thanks very much, Geoff. Donald, thanks for joining the Q&A online. You have a comment on this?
Yes. I mean, you used the word synthesis, and I think this is a key aspect of this, that with the best will in the world, many of us are still working in relatively constrained subdomains of environmental and ecological science. And it would be helpful if we had a model, as we have in the past with ACES, for facilitating more synthetic conversations between those of us who intersect in different ways with cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinary topics of interest. And I think if we could have facilitated activities like this that can look at the intersections between processes and systems, and help us to establish priority roadmaps for the variables that we wish we could be estimating in those contexts, and some guidance on the kind of measurements that might inform those variables most effectively, then I think that could be a really significant way for us to set the agenda for a lot of our data collection and our data integration and modeling activities for the coming decade.
Thanks very much, Donald. Yes, Eleanor, I can see you're ready.
Can I just add to that? I don't know if you can hear me, but I think that's
working?
Urgently needed. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. So I think a model or a set of models that bring together transdisciplinary and intersectionality in the ecosystem sciences space would be urgently needed. One thing I didn't mention in my talk, I guess, that came out of the workshops that I held was that people weren't really aware of the data that is held either. So perhaps a model or a dashboard or something that really enables people to realize, oh, that data actually exists, and a bit of it, you know, it'll show you, oh, and this is what you can do with it, is probably urgently needed. Yeah.
Thanks, Eleanor. Oh.
Yeah, I might just expand on that a little bit as well. I think just from being a little bit closer to the decision-making end of things, a lot of what we need is pretty basic. I know there's been some pretty high-powered, high-technical stuff being discussed here, but simple things like where stuff is still a problem for getting through to decision-makers, to be honest. As much as we'd like to be able to be looking forward for the next 50 years, we've got enough problems right now that we're not dealing with just because we don't know where stuff is. And some of the inherent biases that people have really stand out. I know whenever we're working across Queensland, you know, we look at our vegetation and all that sort of stuff. If it's got trees and shrubs, and that came back to what Eleanor was saying as well, everyone seems really interested. If you start talking about grasslands and deserts, yeah, it's not so interesting. And we know some of those landscapes are going through massive changes as exotic grasses totally replace our native ones in certain parts of the country. And yet we're not really, we don't have a great system for quantifying any of that. Separately, I suppose, I know this is a terrestrial ecosystem research network, but in my spare time I'm a fish geek, and most people don't realise exactly how badly off our freshwater systems are. I know it's been touched on, but all these, looking at the TSX stuff, I hate to think what freshwater stuff would look like, because we probably caved it in 100 years ago, so you're not going to see how devastated things were. But basically, for our freshwater systems, if we don't need it, we generally don't seem to care about it, and we've lost a hell of a lot already. And we've got a lot. You just have to look at the proportion of freshwater species that are in those the red hot lists to be able to see that we've got some really big problems. So we kind of, again, it's a perception thing. We tend not to look under the water. Yeah. So I really encourage anyone who's thinking about it to look there as well.
Thanks, Peter. In fact, your comments there perhaps are addressing the next question that I was going to pose and other people might like to comment on. It appears that most of the threatened species tools and the other tools are based on data discovery, bringing together the data that has already been assembled. Are we doing enough planned survey to strengthen the evidence and to address these gaps that you've all just highlighted? So I think, Peter, you've kicked off the comments on that. Would other people like to talk about how do we gather new data to address the gaps?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is no, we're not doing enough. We're doing some fantastic work in that space, and it's really ramped up in recent decades, but we've still got so much more to do. We need massive investment of resources to do that. I think there's two things we need there. We need rigorous programs by professionals and train people to go out and do the sorts of work that TERN does, for example, with the ecosystem monitoring. But we also need to really need to push citizen science as well, and in a very structured way. So there's some great examples in the UK and North America and parts of Europe where they've got these incredibly well thought out, structured rigorous citizen science programs that deliver the sort of data that we can currently only dream of in Australia that enables. So we've got the Threatened Species Index, which has been great, but over there they've got biodiversity indices because they're monitoring everything. So I think those two pillars are where we need to focus.
Cassandra, thanks.
Yeah, I was also going to make a comment that when we establish the protocols and the programs for collecting information, we make sure that we establish it in a way that it can be used across multiple projects. I know that several in the past have sort of been, oh, we're collecting this information at this point for this purpose. I think we need to broaden that. That's obviously important and we need to keep doing that for certain things, but we also need to broaden it out because there will be things that haven't been yet established that will need that data, or there are parts that could be improved by having that information, but because it was collected in a very specific or a very niche way, it's unable to actually be used. So that's just something to consider as well when looking at future data collection.
Thanks very much, Cassandra.
Yeah, I might just add to that. Does this all work? Is that working? Yeah, just the plenary session this morning that talked about muscle memory in our institutions, I think really hits home for this sort of thing as well. As we've seen government institutions overall shrink in size and some of them chaotically get thrown out and replaced. We've lost a lot of that continuity, and certainly there's a much bigger gap than there used to be between where things are happening on the ground and any information getting back to decision making. And I don't know what the answer is as to how to close that, but it's real and it's evident that quite often decisions are being made without a whole lot of feedback in terms of what impact those decisions are having on both people and on the environment. And so, yeah, if closing those gaps, I think would be great, but I just don't know how you do it given the resourcing that goes into it.
Thanks very much, Peter. Donald, last comment, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. One of the things that I think is also an opportunity for us at this point, and particularly where we have a network such as TERN's that covers so many ecosystems around the country, is to be thinking about the ways we can leverage new advances both in genomics and in, I suppose, AI-assisted image recognition to add invertebrate monitoring to many of our sites. That so much of what we know about biodiversity is really based on vegetation and vertebrate species and a few other charismatic groups. And it seems clear that if we're interested in the rapidly changing context in which we're living, understanding that layer, which may be a lot closer to the boundaries of use of energy, is one that should be very much on our focus. And I think we could do a great deal with near continuous image capture at suitable scales, and also with a lot more metagenomics for invertebrates and fungi as well.
Thanks very much, Donald. Obviously, there's a need there for quite new approaches to data collection as well, and comments have touched on those. I have an eye on the time, so although there are lots more questions, I think we'll need to round this off. Thank you. People who've posed individual questions, perhaps if you'd like to approach the panellists, there are quite a few about the Threatened Species Index, quite a few people offering frog data, quite a few people interested in how all of this evidence is informing environmental planning, bioregional planning in Queensland, and questions I think that we can all take away in terms of how is your work and our work informing the Nature Positive plan that was released last year. So thank you very much to the panel, and I'll hand over to Beryl.
Thank you very much. It's brutal up here. We are breaking for lunch now. Just want to bring to your attention on the program that we're due back in here for our session 3 at 1:45. That's 1:45, 13:45. Does that cover every base? And After you've started your lunch, from about 1:15 to 1:45, the people who are running posters, so Mark, Choi, Kerry, Sally, Abby and Peter would love to tell you about the posters that are sitting out there while you're eating lunch. So do take a chance to find out more about their messages as well. And we'll see you back in here later. Thank you.